identified how high reliability organizations function in a way that actually allows them to, for the most part, avoid accidents. So what is it about their culture that keeps risk at bay in these highly complex organizations and highly critical and dangerous operations? And if we start thinking about high reliability organizations, not just in terms of hospitals, airports, nuclear power stations, but also that societies itself, so high reliability societies are highly complex and full of risk. And we can even scale it up even further and say the planet is a high reliability system where lots of accidents can happen, and there's tight coupling and simultaneity and the high frequency of feedback. So we can start seeing resonances from these theories. So if you go to the next slide, that's where the idea of resilience becomes interesting, because resilience is not just about what happens after a disaster. It also is about how we prevent disaster. So you've got some definitions here from the UN, the ability of a system, community, or society to resist, absorb, accommodate, and to recover from the effect of a hazard. Or even in the latest Sendai framework, how can we build back better for preventing the creation and also reducing existing disaster risk? And the figure that you see on the right, I know you can't read it, but if you go to the next slide, Anthony, it's the top right quadrant that's really interesting, because that's where the high impact and high likelihood crises are clustered. And you can see that we have extreme weather, natural disasters, human-made environmental disasters, cyber attacks, water crisis, biodiversity loss. Those are really high impact, highly likely crises we're experiencing in this century of transboundary crisis, and also made worse by highly likely climate action failure. So 3 degrees is entirely possible and very worrying, as Marie-Christine outlined. So if you go to the next slide, it's important for us to think about resilience critically. So it's not just about demanding that communities, citizens, or PPDR agencies are more resilient, more able to respond to disasters somehow, in a climate of austerity and economic crisis and less resources. Resilience has to be something more than just demanding that people can take more of these crises. I'm sure that will come up in our discussion. If you go to the next slide, this is where Emery's work in particular comes into the field. I think that we can really learn from high reliability organizations' theories, and especially their take on high reliability management. So how do you produce a culture that is able to absorb and to prevent crises in highly complex systems? And I'm not going to go into the detail here, but learning, leadership, and a culture of communication and resilience is very important here to promote disaster prevention. So I'm hoping that this gives us a kind of context for the discussion that we're now to have. If you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so here you have a kind of tentative definition of what transboundary resilience could be, a form of collective, collaborative, equitable resistance that recognizes the complexity of transboundary crisis and the potential for adaptation, and systemic transformation of how we can make our systems better to absorb and to prevent crisis. And just a few words from Frank about the special issue that we're designing. So if you could go to the next slide, and Frank, if you could say.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Monica, for setting the stage for today's webinar. A warm welcome here from Wuppertal in Germany. My name is Frank Fiedrich and I'm chairing the Institute for Public Safety and Emergency Management. And in our research, we look at various aspects of disasters like interorganizational decision-making, information management, and resilience in various aspects like urban resilience or organizational resilience, and also high reliability organizations. So the idea for this special issue came up in a research project we conducted with colleagues from France and Germany. The project was called INCA. It's called a decision framework for improving cross-border area resilience to disasters. And you see the name of my colleagues here. It's Anouk Atro, Eric Rigaud, and Markus Wiens. And when we conducted our research, we actually saw that the relevance of cross-border or transboundary resilience is widely accepted, but there's still a huge need of additional research in this field. So just acknowledging that something is important doesn't really help to advance the field, but it's a starting point. And therefore, we decided to have this call for a special issue in the Journal of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And we would like to invite everybody here to submit a contribution. And if you see the important deadlines, don't be really afraid. It says June 15th. Which is 5 days from now, and we do not really expect that you write and submit a paper within 5 days. So we really are flexible with this date. So if you consider to submit something, just let us know, and we can give you, of course, additional time. And we are not just looking for research papers, we also look at practitioner perspectives, which is really helpful for us. So the practitioner perspectives could be best practices or lessons learned from past crises and past events. And therefore, we would be grateful if you consider submitting something. A couple of people here in this audience I know will submit something. So if you have any questions, just send me an email, and I will also, within the chat, you will find the detailed call for papers. If you have any questions, just let me know or send it through the chat. With that, I hand over again to Monica.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Frank. And also contributions from industry would be more than welcome. If you go to the next slide, that should have the agenda on it. So I now hand over to Philippe Crevolet, and then we have Simon and Kees and Emery to speak, and then we've got time for discussion in between. So very warm welcome, Philippe. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Monica, for your welcome. Thank you to all. Welcome. I'm very happy to be giving you some, I would say, a quick snapshot, because I have certainly a too high number of slides, but I will be passing very quickly some key information. And well, maybe if you need some further information later on, you will be obviously welcome to contact me. I will share my slides. Let me see. How can I do that? Yeah, so here's my window. So it should be all right. Do you see my slides here?
Not yet.
Let me see.
No,
Not yet.
not yet. No.
Let
But,
me see.
oh yeah, then something's happening.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yes. Great.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Okay. I don't see it anymore. What happened with the system is telling me a lot of things. Okay. So now it should be all right. I will maybe need to display setting as a presenter.
And the second one, duplicate?
Yeah, exactly. Is it okay now?
I think you clicked on the first one. If you go back to display settings and choose the second option.
Ah. I'm lost here. Ay. Let me see, because here I don't know how to come back.
If you go back on the top left on display settings.
Yeah, but the issue is that let me see, because I'm blocked on my slides actually. I don't know.
Ah, no, that's good. That's good.
Okay, it's okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, that's very good.
Okay.
Yeah, but we still have the gray square in the middle.
I think that'll disappear.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, do you see my animation? Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
but Philippe,
Okay.
can
Yeah.
you close the window on the side? Yeah, this one. If you could reduce or close it.
Let me see. How do I close it? Like this is okay.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, I will actually bring you a little bit to what we are considering in, because we are now nearly adopting the Horizon Europe work program. So what are actually the topics which are related to transboundary resilience? But I would like to give you a very quick snapshot about where we are coming from, actually from the policy side. And actually, we are, as you know, dealing with a number of policies within DG Home, which are related to disaster resilience, risk reduction. That is not only in the natural hazard part, but also in the accidental and man-made, I would say, threats. And internationally, as Monica already stressed, we are actually looking at the Sendai Framework for Action, so working with you and the DRR. But for us, the clear hook at EU level is the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, which is directly implementing the Sendai Framework for Action. And this covers actually a certain number of parent legislation, which are related to water-related hazards, health-related hazards, accidental, Seveso, cyber and action plan, protection of public spaces and so on, which are more, I would say, dealing with security. So we are actually in a situation which is not that easy, because we have a certain number of sectors to be looked at, which are not working specifically in the same policy DGs, which have to work very closely together, mixing issues related to safety in a way and other related to security. And these are not the same animals, as you know. So we have done actually a certain number of dialogue setting with between policymaker, research academia, community, industry SME, practitioners, even civil society organization, to ensure that we are gathering actors to discuss the main research needs and what we have at hand. Research need to respond more effectively to different policy requirements, and it has actually come to a certain number of leading projects being identified. We have a overwhelming number of projects funded by different programs, not only research, but capacity buildings, training, and so on, which are not necessarily working together. So we have a dispersed effort actually being done, which and we lack a kind of critical mass and a kind of in a way, logic way of working, which is identifying research, performing research, and then having capacity building, education. This loop is not really in place. It can be in place in some instances, but it's not strategically thought to be like this. So we try to improve this in our dialogue setting. And in Horizon Europe, well, you certainly know that we have different pillars, and we are in pillar 2, which are related to global challenges and European industrial competitiveness. We have 6 different clusters, and our program is working in as cluster 3, civil security for society. And in these objectives, not naturally, we are supporting a certain number of policies, including the security and union strategy, but also EU disaster risk reduction policies and the new EU climate adaptation strategy. And in the program, we have 6 main destinations, mainly dealing with fight against crime and tourism, border management, resilient infrastructure, and disaster resilient society. And it's where the transboundary, I would say, resilience aspects are being looked at. And we have also an horizontal destination, which is considering strengthening security research and innovation for example, funding networks of practitioners, market studies, foresight studies, and so on. And DigiConnect as a cybersecurity and secure online environment related calls. So in please don't read the text. I simply wish to highlight that in the work program, the DRS, that is Disaster Resilience Society destination, as an introduction that you will discover in the work program next year. It's really to and I would like to highlight the red part, that is enhanced capacity in risk and resilience management, intersectoral cooperation, different sectors, international policy implementation, cross-border, cross-sectorial. We are really in the heart of your current discussions on transboundary resilience management. And it also covers international cooperation. The word integrated approach is very important. We are trying to bridge different policies areas. We are trying to ensure that we have joint efforts which are transdisciplinary, transboundary nature, shifting the paradigm from managing disasters. In fact, it was the former IOGO framework for action. It was really looking at the upstream part to managing risk, which is actually what the Sendai framework for action is telling us. That is preparedness, prevention, and response indeed, but not only response. Actually, it's more focusing on prevention. So here we have indeed different impacts which are expected from the call, raising resilience of European society from international to local level. And I will pass very quickly. I'm sorry because the time is very, very limited. I will give you the key titles of the different calls that we are looking at, just stressing that the transboundary resilience aspect is present in many of our DRS calls. If you see in 2021, we have issues related to improve understanding of risk exposure, public awareness, and in 2022, in this area related to societal resilience, we are focusing on the citizen preparedness in case of disaster, but as well as preparedness again of high impact, low probability, or unexpected events. We are willing to also to look at improved quality assurance for data, which are being used for better managing disaster risks, and including transboundary risks. Better understanding of citizen behavioral and psychological reaction. Again, this is really societal aspects, and it is complementing by another area, which is about improved disaster risk management and governance. And here again, you see the integrated aspects on disaster risk reduction, focusing on extreme climate events. And you see from early warning to resilience building, as well as enhanced assessment of disaster risk. Here, I wanted really to put something on lesson learned, and looking at historical data and projections, because we need to also have cross-disciplinary cooperation with historians, because we are losing track completely of things that have happened even 1 century ago. We are losing our memory. And we want also to look at standardization aspects. And finally, here in 2022, we will be also looking at impact forecasting for any kind of disasters. We have done that in the climate area, which has been actually quite effective, trying to anticipate an extreme events where it will be, I would say, occurring in a vulnerable area, gaining time, and improve disaster risk pricing assessment, that is looking also at insurance and reinsurance. And finally, we have an area which is looking specifically on capacities of first and second responders. And obviously, we will be focusing here with a topic which is directly related to pandemics, to have fast deployed mobile laboratories, but also on CBRN actually. And here we have really awareness, preparedness for first responders for CBRN related events, and for more efficient rescue operation. So it has been very quick. You will also, I would say, maybe be interested to hear that the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, that is DGECO, is developing what they call a Union Civil Protection Knowledge Network to, I would say, gather knowledge and be better linked to to science and development to support their operational needs and actions. And this is, in fact, they will play the role of knowledge broker, partnership facilitating innovation catalysts. And I would like to say that I'm in this steering committee, and I've told them that we are doing a lot to gather these different type of categories, policymakers, practitioners, researchers, with also industry SMEs and civil society. And this is coming through the community of users. Many of you know certainly this community of users that have been growing up since 2014, which is now becoming CERIS, that is Community for European Research and Innovation for Security, with objectives to raise awareness, analyzing capability needs, identifying solutions to address the gaps, synergies among different instruments, and we will be releasing annual state-of-the-art report. I will do that. I will do one in the DRS area, including also horizontal aspects like standardization and citizen and dimension. So this is about the same kind of structure that I said, that I mentioned, research projects, gathering research project and capacity building and training, policy integrating, looking at market dimension, using networks which have a mediation capacity among the different disciplines, that is, well, the different sectors, research, policy, market, and so on. So we are really trying to establish a very strong forum to have I would say, better identify the gaps, the needs, better disseminate research output, including to policymakers. This is a structure that will be developing from September onward. It has already been starting. All the acronyms correspond to the 6 destinations that I've mentioned. We will have an expert group running to really focus on objectives which are our role is to contribute to a better implementation of policies. If you are interested to join this series, you are most welcome to subscribe because we are regularly sending information. And if you need more information, don't hesitate at all to contact me by mail. I will be very happy to help you guide finding your way in this very, very complex landscape. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippe. I see that there is a question from Monica in the chat that is addressed to you. In order to, I mean, let me take it. The question was about the involvement of citizens. So is there a way that citizens could be involved in, I mean, previous COU, but CERIS? And what are the plans for attracting and increasing this participation?
I would say that it's a very delicate aspect of our program, because what we are coming from some I would say dialogue which were not easy to set between science and practitioners. I'm in my job, I've been working in the policy sector, in water policy sector, some 15 years ago. Already at that time, the difficulty was to have a dialogue between science and policy. I'm a scientist by background. I was coming to deal with a policy, water policy. So my job was to draft a new directive. And I naturally asked the scientists to help me. But I was completely confronted with a different type of views regarding a given water problem. So I had to work on interfacing this science policy, I would say, communities, and it worked, but it took time. When I started to work in disaster resilience, I realized that it was not only science policy, it's science policy practitioners discussing with first responders, emergency people, plus SME industry, because if you are developing tools by academia that are even discussed with practitioners, it was not the case 5-6 years ago, and I would say not discussing with SME and industry to ensure that these tools will be put on the market, well, we are not, I would say, making any difference. And this societal aspect came actually in the program 2 or 3 years ago. And we really stress that we would need to make a kind of societal research effort in our program, but without knowing exactly how to attract the citizens. And after 2 years, I see that in fact there is some progress, but there is citizens are being attracted by involving, for example, municipalities, regional authorities, civil society organization, but I don't see really people from the street, coming, and the way I drafted Horizon Europe topics is really to say, involve citizens. I don't know yet exactly, I don't have a solution, but we need to find actually a way to reach this level, to raise awareness, to understand better their reactions, their psychological reaction, and to make a difference in Europe, to really establish a culture of better understanding the risk. In Japan, people, I would say from the very early age to the elderly age, they know how to behave in the case of an earthquake. They will have been trained at school. In very few examples in Europe, we see this that it happens, but I don't have really the solution. We are putting that on paper, and I hope that we will find in a way to involve this citizen dimension.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, Marie-Christine, I'm just conscious of the there are quite a lot of questions in the chat for you, Philippe, and
I will respond.
Yeah, and we'll have some time after Simon's presentation where we can take questions together and get into a discussion. So I would like to hand over to Simon and give you some time to have a look at the questions in the chat. And I think it's fantastic work that you're doing with the citizens' engagement. Very important and very challenging and very, very interesting. So an exercises like EdRex could actually be a way of doing it. I don't know what you think about that, Simon, but if you show us your slides and take us through your presentation, then we can maybe get back to that.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
Have the slides come up?
Something's happening. Yes, they have. Yeah, there they are. Yep, brilliant.
Great. Right. Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank the organizers of this event for all of their hard work and also for the kind invitation to sit on this panel. I'm enjoying it tremendously. It's been really, really interesting to hear the initial presentation and also the great presentation from Philippe. I'm Simon Hollis. I'm Associate Professor in Political Science at the Swedish Defence University, where I teach and conduct research on transnational aspects of disaster management, disaster risk reduction, resilience, and also more recently I've been looking into aspects related to resilience and the Anthropocene. But today I've been asked to talk about my reflections since participating and assisting in the design and implementation of EDREX, the first European disaster response exercise. I'll therefore begin this talk with briefly outlining the main features of EDREX before discussing 3 reflections on transgovernmental disaster resilience in Europe. And I was actually really pleased to hear Philippe's presentation, because I think it really folds very nicely into what I'm going to present as well. Although what I'm going to present is perhaps just a very specific part of the multiplicity of what transboundary resilience is and can be. Also just I'm making the assumption here that most of you will be familiar with some of the EU terminology I'll be using. And don't worry if you don't, as the message that I really want to get across with my reflections have a lot less jargon and some more purpose. So, EDREX. EDREX was a 2-year cross-sectorial disaster response exercise funded by the European Commission and run by a consortium that included Public Health England, the Italian Presidency of the Council of Ministers, and the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency as the lead organizer. And I myself was requisitioned from my university to assist the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency as an advisor and assistant in all aspects of the exercise. So the main aim of the exercise, as you can see on the slide there, was to explore, further develop and assess the combined crisis response capabilities of the ERCC and its interlocutors at the national, European and international level. So more specifically, the purpose of the exercise was to assess the coordination of the UCPM, as well as look at the holistic humanitarian aid coordination within the European Union, as well as the invocation of the solidarity clause. And this purpose would be achieved through a series of planning conferences in Brussels, leading to a discussion-based exercise and a command post exercise, as well as an evaluation and development conference to discuss the main findings from these exercises. The participants, the invited participants included the EUCPM participating states, some EU institutions and agencies, as well as a number of international organizations. The actual participation for the discussion-based exercise included 19 UCPM participating states, 8 commission and international organizations, and the participation for the command post exercise also included 8 European institutions and more than 20 UCPM participating states, which was equivalent to roughly 900 participants. So it was quite a large-scale multi-sectorial exercise. That took some planning. That's why it took 2 years to do to complete the whole exercise. After quite a bit of discussion, I have to say, which I'll come back to, the final scenario was based on a large earthquake occurring in a fictitious non-EU country called Valand. Now, this earthquake quickly became complex as it would lead to a temporary closing of a nuclear power facility, as well as the outbreak of forest fires and the buildup of refugees on the EU border. Now, the goal with all of this was to trigger the activation of the UCPM by UN agencies, something that at that time was newly drafted in the legislation. In addition to this, there was we were also looking at the process of activating the IPCR from monitoring mode to full activation mode. Sorry, the IPCR is the Integrated Political Crisis Response Arrangements facilitated through the Council Secretariat. And then there was also finally, we discussed, we didn't really exercise through the command post exercise, the invocation of the solidarity clause. So jumping straight to the recommendations and outcomes of this exercise, the 4 main outcomes, I think it just really generally touched on what scholars of crisis management refer to as sense-making, decision-making, and meaning-making. So that is response capacities concerned with establishing or improving situational awareness, including the evaluation of incomplete information, making decisions based on this information, and then lastly, communicating this to the public and to other sectors. So that was my very brief introduction to EDREX. Now for some more reflection. So first up, how does all this relate to disaster resilience? And I think answering this question is largely going to be determined by how we define the concept itself. And when I last checked, there were at least 88 definitions of disaster resilience within disaster studies alone. So it's a bit of a minefield. Nevertheless, when thinking about EDREX in terms of resilience, one could argue that it was an exercise designed to increase the resilience of communication lines, coordination efforts, situational analysis, and so on and so forth. That is, purpose was to strengthen the strength of critical response capacities when put under strain to ensure nothing breaks. And for those of you who are familiar with resilience studies, you'll already see that this is very, very close to the classical understanding of what resilience is, or this the engineering approach to resilience based on Hooke's law. Right, so you have a piece of metal that that bends to the point where it can either comes back to its equilibrium or it breaks. Now, what's quite interesting here is, and what EDREX did not do well, in a sense, although it was discussed in the discussion-based exercise, was another type of resilience that is championed by the EU external humanitarian aid development initiatives, as well as the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office and the IFRC, as well as most of the other major global players, like including UNDP and World Bank. That is a socio-ecological idea of resilience that places much more focus on local level adaptation and even transformation. Something that we've it's already brought up earlier today. And it's interesting to note that here that internal efforts within the EU tend to focus on technical solutions, while its external policies tend to focus more on social solutions. Now, of course, this is quite a large generalization, and it does not mean the EU is not promoting social solutions at the local level. It's certainly doing that, and there are a lot of good initiatives. Rather, just my point here is that it sometimes is overshadowed by more of a technical focus. We also see that a minority of projects that the EU have developed to increase disaster resilience within Europe at the local level employ bottom-up methodologies and tend to miss a significant connection to community and agency, or to put into what we already talked about today, getting contact to people on the streets, right? So yeah, I would say defining what local means and ensuring long-term change remains perhaps one of the a considerable barrier for resilience projects within and certainly beyond Europe. So first reflection that I wanted to bring up based on EDREX here is that we exercise capacities we already have. There are a lot of and here there was a lot of discussion about what scenario would be best when we were designing EDREX. However, most disasters that would exceed the present capacities that EU have were in the end rejected. These included mega disasters, wildcards, or black swans, such as solar storms or complex disasters that involve geopolitical concerns, such as the EU's relationship with Russia at that stage, or even today. And other scenarios too complex to exercise also were included in this, like the idea of creeping crises. COVID is a good example of that, the migration crisis and the AIDS epidemic. So there are a lot of, and this is where, this is why we're talking about the problem or the difficulty of transboundary resilience in the first place. But I wanted to make this point here, and that point is that it is important to keep in mind disasters that may overwhelm not just member states, but also EU crisis response capacities. It's important to be honest about the limits of transboundary disaster resilience. And so what can we do? What can we do when to face up to the limitations of transboundary resilience? And I believe, and I think some of you will agree with me here, that a way of dealing with these types of risks that many say seem to be likely to increase in frequency and intensity is by transferring responsibility to the local level in the form of encouraging local adaptation. And now, I'm not saying here is that every individual should be resilient. I'll get to this in a moment, but that the idea of encouraging community resilience is really the golden question here, or the golden problem. Right, reflection 2.
We lost the presentation.
I'll try to
yeah, share again your screen.
share again.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon.
It keeps cutting out, I'm afraid. I'll just try again. I'll try once more. Otherwise, I mean, I can continue without. It was. I mean, we'd almost.
Maybe if Anthony, we're short of time. If Anthony tries to share the presentation, and you continue speaking, Simon, and then we can catch up a little bit.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Right.
Yes,
So we're almost at the end. So the second reflection. Right. Yeah. That resilience wasn't actually really mentioned in EDREX, but it was definitely enacted. So there was a lot of, well, okay, walking the walk, but there was no talking the talk here. The impetus and the exercise, at least from the operational side of disaster response, was clearly about getting the job done, about quickly and effectively responding to in an adaptive manner to mitigate further risk and bounce back to a state of normalcy. The concept of sovereignty or resilience, for example, were really non-issues for participating states in particular. We find transboundary cooperation on crisis management, I mean, did not come from an explicit impetus to shift sovereignty concerns, as a lot of least academics would think, away from the state, nor was it about financial gain. Rather, motivation for cooperation amongst the participants was guided by more of a practical logic of resilience that necessarily adjusts itself according to the uniqueness of a particular disaster. And in this sense, member states or participating states, to be more accurate, insistence on the principle of subsidiarity was really important in order to ensure their ability to be resilient. It was important to maintain the sense of localness and the response capacities, and in order to have that flexibility, which which is this other type of resilience that we talk about when we talk about adaptation. So the point I wish to make here is that it is practice and problem solving that provided the grounds for incremental development of the EU CPM. And here resilience was not a specified end goal, it was hardly talked about. But it was already there, and participating states made an effort to insist that it should remain there. In other words, you could translate this that too much transboundary capacities could actually be harmful for enacting transboundary resilience if it's not done thoughtfully. Now, the last or second last slide refers to reflections 3 there. So the final reflection I want to make is one that I already hinted at throughout this presentation, and that's the importance of strengthening local disaster resilience. In relation to improving a specific technical response capacity, a UN official here talks about, it's important trying to be as local as possible and focus on local responders is really essential. And this is really important, but there's a lot more to transboundary local resilience than that. It's all very well and good, but as I've already noted, local level resilience is not just about effective on-the-ground communication and reporting. It's not just about measurable response capacities. Local disaster resilience is also about community solidarity. It's about social capital, and it's about building trust. It's about engaging with and strengthening civil society, as Philip mentioned, as well as social networks, which can be achieved, I think, through, for example, education and activating youth as young leaders and so on and so forth. It is through these types of activities that the EU already supports externally that it could also reinforce internally. So I think that the EU could learn through greater self-reflection, holistically at least, and building trans-local resilience. Yeah, and there I'll finish. The last slide was further reading on EDRICS, but it was also some self-promotion there. But the slides should be available. I take it for everyone to look at later. So
Yeah.
thank you for your attention.
That's great. Thank you very much, Simon. And it really follows on very, very inspiringly from Philippe's talk. We need to catch up a little bit on time. So I would like to pick out Philippe's question on the technical focus of EU policies. He asks, he says, this is not my perception when looking at policies such as the EU Flood Directive, the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, and climate action plans related to adaptation. So they all have a clear societal dimension. So why do you say external policies are more socially focused? And then I can put the two of you in discussion for a few minutes.
Thanks. I mean, you have to accept my comments, but based on as I said, reflections on EDRICS, and here there was a lot of focus on technical measures and very little focus on social measures. But also, I think, I mean, what I tried to emphasize there at the end of my presentation is really what I think is really necessary and what is really difficult. I think you have mentioned this too, Philip, is that it's really about attracting people on the streets. It's about looking for sustainable solutions in terms of our resilience projects over time. And there, it's about going. It's about looking at education and civil society, and trying to understand local worldviews of resilience, and trying to match that with or support those existing local worldviews, rather than trying to say, okay, well, this is what you should do. I think that's really what I was getting at.
But what I wanted to stress is that there are not the text, I would say the EU legislation, which is too technical. It's the way it is being implemented by the member states. If I take the example of the Water Framework Directive and Flood Directive, you have a participatory approach within the river basin management planning. People are supposed to be consulted by the member states for any kind of measures that will potentially affect them. The only thing is that they don't take this, I would say, opportunity, because they are not prepared by their own government to do that. And it's so easy, to say, well, we are not informing you sufficiently, because you could, I would say, take your, power as European citizen to tell your government that they are not implementing the EU law properly. So it's why I said it's not the technical nature, it's the way it is being implemented more or less faithfully by the member states, which is at cause there.
So you're saying, if I can understand you right, so you're saying that the problem lies in the national implementation of resilience.
National and sometimes even regional implementation. Here I'm speaking about the river basin dimension. And systematically after I would say there are 6 years river basin management planning, and people at a certain moment have to be, it's legally binding, they have to be consulted. And they are actually consulted, but not really informed about their right.
What about more long-term initiatives that focus, that may not touch directly on talking about resilience, but actually produce resilience in the long term. For example, in terms of creating greater social cohesion, for example, is that something that you know, a way forward?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it will certainly have an effect. Yeah, but in fact, it is also empowering people, and it's also linked to raising awareness. And you spoke about education. It is linked to education, raising awareness. People have to act with a good knowledge of the situation, but they are not trained to have a good knowledge of the situation, even by their own governments.
There's a contribution here from Rachel Gianfranchi. She says that one element she'd like to add to the discussion, DMA at national levels are facing financial constraints in purchasing even the most basic early public warning systems. Policies are helpful, but enabling industry to provide its services commercially while helping countries to establish their national emergency management systems needs to become a priority. So more practical industry and budgetary issues arising there.
Do you want me to say something here?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, I mean, this idea that I brought up at the end about translocalness, you know, is that could be talking about solutions as a way forward. Also, with this problem that Philippe talked about, that you know, this problem that you know, the national level can't really don't have the ability, or in this case, maybe the finances aren't there. But you know, but there are plenty of what we call transgovernmental networks that exist today. You know, that they have the finances, and that can be more directly focused on trying to promote resilience. So this idea of translocalness, you know, I think it would definitely be worth looking into, thinking about a little bit more. And also that's the way that the EU could support like grassroots level resilience as well.
Yeah. And that, do you see that intersect with the civil protection mechanism?
I don't know, maybe Philip would be maybe answer that better than I could.
There are some. There are clearly here. Well, there are clearly, I would say, actions that are more directly related to the UCPM, but also the rescue mechanism, by which we indeed try to stimulate the member states to have capacities to respond better and to prevent better to disaster risk management. But it's actually, we are here again in a subsidiarity situation. So we are giving a framework, but we cannot oblige the member states indeed to we had the example with the pandemics. You know, the pandemic crisis is really typically the example. We don't have this, I would say, legacy to do that. You know, so we try to indeed stimulate. And I fully agree with Raquel. It is the trend that should be followed, but not easy at the EU level. From the EU level side, it's not easy.
Yeah, great. I'm going to move us on now to Kees. Yes.
May just invite Simon to look at the chat, because there are many reactions and questions. So if you want to comment, you can do it directly.
Yeah, but both of you, Philippe and Simon, if you keep looking at the chat and participate in the discussion, that's really very, very valuable. One point that I was thinking was about how people are not necessarily willing to be prepared and don't want to take the responsibility, don't want to, they just want to be safe. They don't want to actually become involved. And I think that might be something that links to Kees's presentation. So Kees, if you put your presentation up and get us started thinking on societal resilience, and remember to speak loud.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, I will start sharing my screen. Let me see.
Yeah, something's coming. It's there. Yeah.
Can you see it? I will put it in the presentation mode. So okay, you can see it in the presentation mode.
Could you change your display settings?
Yeah.
The second. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah. All right.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah,
good. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me, Monica. Actually, the discussion that we are having is sort of paving the way of what I'm going to say. And actually, it was quite tempting to throw away my whole presentation and start over. But still, there are some slides that I think are related to the discussions that we are just having. My talk about transboundary societal resilience, I think the main takeaway is that we have to understand the local in order to be to have a resilient transboundary governance approach to the crisis that we are facing. So that is sort of in a nutshell my story. So the presentation for today is partly based on a paper that I wrote with one of my PhD students on a case in the Netherlands on the local response to the COVID-19 crisis, but I will widen the scope a bit to address issues that we have been discussing and touched upon. Monica, you already started to sort of make sense of the current crisis, namely the COVID-19 crisis, and it has been referred to as a transboundary, transborder crisis, which referring to the disaster governance literature by Boyne and many others, can also be seen as a slow-burning, creeping crisis, and in that sense, COVID-19 is one of those crises that we arguably will face a lot and live through a lot more, like climate change related crisis, like extreme weather and what have you. But focusing on the COVID-19 crisis, it's indeed to be considered a slow burning, creeping crisis. Obviously meaning that it is quite hard to set boundaries in time, but also in itself it's transboundary. As a matter of fact, a pandemic is global, and it is cross-border also in the sense that it is it stretches across different organizations, administrations, functional borders, as you refer to, Monica. So in that sense, cross-border and transboundary for me also means that it needs inter-organizational or inter-administrational collaboration and coordination. I'm currently working on the COVID-19 crisis in a European project, not a DRS2 project, but a COVID-19 project called HEROES, a Health Emergency Response in Interconnected Systems, in which we look into global supply chains and how they are vulnerable. We look into actual behavior of citizens. And my role in this project is to zoom into the governance, really, of the COVID-19 crisis. A big task, I can tell you. The other project I would like to refer to, because it has been mentioned in the discussion, that the Horizon Europe, at least Horizon 2020 did, invested a lot in projects addressing disaster resilience. So the LINKS project is one of those projects that are funded under the Disaster Resilience Society's European project. So, and I'm heading that project. You can find more details on the website of that project. That project really is addressing risk perception and risk communication by taking social media and crowdsourcing more seriously. So as an attempt to indeed harvest the local knowledge. By citizen groups, local networks, and what have you. So that's the ambition in that project. Back to the governance approach that we developed in the HEROES project. That is really to recognize the different layers that you need in analyzing the crisis in the first place, but also in practical terms, so for practitioners and policymakers to embrace. So that is to say that the governance approach to crises such as COVID-19, so slow burning, creeping, transboundary, transborder, for us needs to be based on what we call the whole of society or inclusive governance approach. And maybe you will say, okay, that's an open door. But if you look at the policies, often you will see that it will stuck with multi-level approach, the best, which means that global guidelines are translated to a local level. And in those processes of translation, the question then is who is involved in that process of translation? What kind of expertises are allowed, so to say, to make that translation? And also, is the local knowledge actually appreciated in that process of translation? Is there also a translation from bottom to and upwards? So to move beyond a little bit though, that multi-level governance approach, we also paid attention in the HEROES project towards the network governance approach, meaning that you pay more attention to, or should pay more attention to, inter-organizational collaboration, to the idea that the response of the one will influence the response of the other, so to interconnectedness and all that. It may relate to the idea of high reliability in the sense that it moves towards high reliable networks, and the question is what mechanisms or what kind of components are shaping a high reliable network rather than standalone high reliable organizations. For today, however, I will focus more on the participatory let's say dimension of the whole of society governance approach, and which really means the recognition of bottom-up processes like citizens' initiatives, the civil society, spontaneous volunteers, social movements having a more political agenda towards societal change, but also public-private partnerships. So to recognize really that part, that dimension of crisis and disaster governance. Just a few words on resilience, because I know I'm speaking to a really knowledgeable audience. For us, resilience moves beyond the idea of bouncing back. It's really about the adaptive capacity of systems, be it organizations or societies or communities, to not just respond to a crisis, but do it in such a way that the next crisis can be either prevented or more easily to overcome. So you'll find those kind of definitions in public administration, organization sciences literature, well-known scholars like Louisa Comfort, Boyne, Demchak, but also Kathleen Tierney and others. What I found interesting, though, is also to look into the more, let's say, ethnographic or anthropological literature that is not often or not enough, maybe, I don't know, recognized in the disaster literature. For example, by Hoffman, Oliver Smith, and others. That really pays ask for to pay attention for vulnerability. So vulnerability sort of is closely related to the concept of resilience. And your slide, Monica, on stop calling me resilient, that reminds me of this idea. So quite often resilience is called upon, but really people can be in vulnerable positions if they don't really have the means to protect themselves and what have you. At the same time, recognizing vulnerability is not to say that people are helpless or sheer victims. No, they still have the capacity or they have assets, be it local knowledge or their local network, social capital, if you will, that potentially can make them resilient if it is recognized, if it is interlinked with the actions by formal authorities, formal response organizations. So that is my idea of resilience. Then if you zoom in to what happens at the local, and again, so maybe this is sort of a paradox, but recognizing what is going on at the local is important in transboundary crisis. What I found really useful is, and still a source of inspiration is the tradition that has been developed at the Disaster Research Center. Back in the day, the Carotellian Dines, but picked up by James Kendra and Tricia Wachtendorf and others, is really to recognize how things on the local, how activities on the local are organized. So this is sort of a typology that you see in front of you of the kind of organizations responding or preparing, responding to disasters or preparing for disasters. That is the established and expanding organizations. Those are the organizations that you would expect to respond, like call them the fire service, Red Cross, and what have you. They have their regular task in responding to crisis situations, whether or not they will reinvent themselves in new structures or build on old structures. I'm interested in this talk on those organizations or ways of organizing that really emerge at times of crisis, or in organizations that find a role for themselves, being not necessarily a member of the response family, so to say. So for them, it's non-regular task based on either old structures or new structures. And to make that concrete, I have two examples that are that have been part of the projects that I was referring to. This is a lot of pictures, but that builds on the idea that at the local level, there is almost a guarantee that you will see spontaneous volunteers active during crisis situations. Also, to go beyond the heat of the moment, so to say, also in preparing and building resilient societies. So at the left-hand side, you see a book that inspired me in the first wave, so to say, of the COVID-19 crisis. It's called A Pandemic Solidarity, that has cases from virtually all over the world where you see bottom-up initiatives emerging in response to the COVID-19 crisis, for example, by providing free meals in local neighborhoods by citizens. Why? Because the citizens, they know the social fabric in their neighborhood better than the formal authorities. So there was a foreword by Rebecca Solnit, who wrote that sort of famous book, another book that inspired me, that was called Paradise Built in Hell, in which she has similar stories based on historic events. In the middle, you see two pictures in Dutch, samen vooruit, that is together, we are moving forward together, and below that picture, you see a picture of spontaneous volunteers providing free meals in Amsterdam. So those are spontaneous volunteers that, for me, were sort of, forgive me the word, a case study in the European project. However, I was also, be it at a distance, involved in those activities. And at the right-hand side, and that was for me really interesting, you see a similar case from Rome, that was proposed by one of the partners in the HEROES project, that is the Italian Red Cross, and that is a case developed by Agnese Rollo, and you saw a similar kind of activities going on in Rome. And there was, of course, there was no interaction between Amsterdam and Rome for that matter, but there was a pattern of local social behavior that you could recognize emerging in so many cities in Europe and of course beyond. We actually started to act upon what we saw in those moments of spontaneous volunteering, building on an initiative that we started about 2 years ago by setting up what we call Amsterdam Living Labs, in order to bring together potentially spontaneous volunteers and formal authorities, formal response organizations. In the first year of our project, we based our Living Lab meetings on scenarios, heat waves, flooding and drought. But later on, halfway the Living Lab project, the COVID-19 crisis started to be more severe, and we continue doing our Living Lab sessions online. So at the right-hand side, at the top, you see a Living Lab session that we held a year and a half ago with the question really to the neighborhood, local citizens, what will going on in your city if there is a heat wave going on for 3 weeks? Where do you go to? Where do you get your information? What can you bring to the table, and so forth and so on. And we continue to do that in the first wave of the COVID-19 crisis. And Monica is already pointing out that I'm almost running out of time. So this was for us a really important case to embrace the idea that you have to work with the local, be inclusive. So localization that usually is used in humanitarian actions in the global south is actually in COVID-19 and in transboundary crisis important all over. I will then be shorter than I was planned on the other case, which is, and I will only use this slide and then I go to the conclusion. I will share my PowerPoint anyway. And that is an extending organization, which is the refugee company that actually is for me a social enterprise. That was active in the forgive me the word, the previous European crisis, namely 2015-16, with a relatively steep influx of refugees from the Syrian war and sub-Saharan Africa, where they started to respond to the crisis not just by providing help, but really starting to work with the refugees, working together, use their knowledge. That, I mean, they are not just victims, but they have really useful knowledge. They started to work with them, integrated them in the local neighborhoods and what have you, and they remained active after the European refugee crisis, and they started to respond to the COVID-19 crisis in rather unexpected ways. So to start up a domestic production of face masks during the period there was a shortage of face masks. This is a longer story. It's a case study that I can send you a conference paper that we wrote about. So I will skip through a couple of quotes that will further elaborate that case. So my really sort of discussion and conclusion as the things that I would like to highlight is even when we talk about transborder crisis, understanding the local is really important, and appreciate what is going on at the local level. Different kind of actors or stakeholders are becoming active. Social entrepreneurs was my example. But maybe also others. So we should look beyond the usual suspects, so to say. And then recognition of all this is not enough. So again, I'm with you, Monica, to say stop call us resilient as long as you don't share resources, as long as you don't open, and you as the formal authorities and formal response organizations, as long as you not start to collaborate, then it becomes a rather sort of a neoliberal trick, like, okay, you are on your own now, no resources needed because you are vulnerable. So that is not my story, but recognizing the local and the local knowledge, I think that is vital.
That's great, Kis. Really great contribution. There are plenty of questions in the chat, and I would like now to hand over to Emery. There's design in the design of this session. We've put the talks together so that it kind of builds to this. So we've kind of gone all the way down to the local, and now we're broadening back out to think about how can we build a safety and security culture? And then after Emery's talk, we put Emery and Kees into discussion and answering some of the questions and have some time to talk. So Emery, take it away. And I think Anthony is sharing your slides. Yep, there we go. Wonderful.
Thank you very much for inviting me to provide this presentation. I will be talking about high reliability management, and of course I'll define it and go through examples, but for the sake of making it vivid to you, if you all stood up and walked to your door and walked through that door into the control rooms of your existing electricity grids, natural gas grids, telecommunications centers, financial service trading floors, and so on, you would see and you would be in the midst and you would be witnessing high reliability management. And I don't want you to lose the fact that I'm talking about something that we could be doing. It's something that we are actually doing. Next slide, please. Now, Monica, in the introduction, made reference to original literature on high reliability organizations. Again, today, if you walked into nuclear power plants, air traffic control centers, vessel traffic service centers, you would find classic HROs, very complex socio-technical systems managed more reliably than normal accidents theory would predict. Why are these things managed, these complex systems managed, when we would expect their tight coupling and complex interactivity, the simultaneity, to have more accidents? And the answer is, well, they're not technical systems, they're socio-technical systems. HRM in particular, the high reliability management, is developed in response to increasingly interconnected large-scale systems, each seeking to be in effect an HRO on its own. So water is connected to electricity, electricity is connected to natural gas. Each wants to be in real time, able to prevent major system failures from happening, but they're interconnected in ways that their inputs to do so affect their outputs, and their inputs come from other infrastructures. The interconnected nature of these large-scale systems most often crosses formal jurisdictions, including city, state, province, national borders. HRM, as such, is inherently transboundary. Okay, it's inherently the case in Europe that if I talked about the Dutch natural gas sector, I would be talking about cross-border natural gas distribution, and so on and so on. HRM, to get to the nub, is defined in real-time infrastructure operations as ensuring the safe and continuous provision of the infrastructure's critical service, even during, especially during, turbulent times. That is, they're actively managing their critical infrastructures today, where you are, in a way that will prevent system failure, even if things get difficult, environmentally or so on. Now, I know that this presentation or this discussion has been under the rubric of emergency management, and of course, emergency management and all of your directives talk about prevention as if it were a continuum with response. Well, there are actually important similarities and differences between preventing disasters from happening in ongoing infrastructure operations and emergency management for transboundary resilience. And next slide, please. And I would like to begin by highlighting the differences, okay? And if only to make visible trade-offs with respect to the allocation of scarce resources and Euro budgets, and talk about, as I will be going forward, talking about the fact that there are very, very important differences between preventing using ongoing critical infrastructures. If you look at this slide, the core principle and practices of HRM is Monica's wonderful formulation. High reliability management is the first rather than last line of real-time defense for preventing disasters and emergencies. They do that every day. If you went into these infrastructures and watched these control rooms, you would watch them preventing transboundary disasters happening all the time. For example, to make it real, cybersecurity, Philippe mentioned just in passing cybersecurity, the infrastructures we study here in California, they're habitually attacked, 25,000 or more attacks a day, just in cybersecurity alone. We only see it when it happens. But in the cases, a classic case of funding emergency management and disaster prevention is we don't see all of the things that don't happen, and which is a good thing. Now, the core practices for preventing and high reliability management is high input variance and low stable output variance require high process variance. This is the law sometimes referred to the law of requisite variety. A control grid for electricity faces high input variance, weather, funding, local reactions, customer reactions, demand response, and it has to maintain low and stable output. Electricity, natural gas, telecommunications has to actually be reliable and safe. And to do that, the law of requisite variety says you have to have high process variance. High process variance, many options and strategies. Emergency management, again, I'm trying to make trade-offs visible, okay? Emergency management as disaster response, okay, means a disaster or emergency happens and it must be responded to differently as a system in failure vastly differs from the system in normal or disrupted operations. Failure is a fundamentally different state of operations, okay? And the core practice here is high process variance is needed to moderate high input and high output variance. There is no hope once the disaster happens that you have complete control over it and can maintain recovery and the establishment of a new normal as effectively as you can maintain the operations of an ongoing critical infrastructure. Now, next two slides are very, very important for the discussions that we are having today. Next slide, please. In high reliability management, this may seem obvious to you, those of you who are practitioners listening, but believe me, it is not obvious to many people outside. In high reliability management, multiple states of infrastructure operation matter. It is not as modelers or system designers say that there are two states really that matter, normal and failed. For high reliability management, there has to be a differentiation, a much finer, nuanced differentiation between different states of operations. And here you see normal operations. The first thing about normal operations from a control room's view is they're not invariant operations. If in fact they were invariant operations, they would be totally unreliable. Normal operations are characterized by fluctuations of actual behavior in real time in order to maintain stable and low output variance. It takes a lot of work to keep that electricity going at the frequency required. Then there is disruption, temporary loss of service, with or without restoration. Okay, disruption is highly important, as we'll see in a moment. There is outright failure, where in fact it's not just the temporary loss of service, it's the actual destruction of assets, okay, that matter. And it also ties to the point of the system in failure is vastly different than the system in normal operations. To phrase that differently and most practically, normal operations of real infrastructures in real time are very poor predictors of what the system in failure will look like. That's why they're doing so much to try to, that's why there's such dread over failure in real-time operations, because the system in failure looks like nothing like they would have predicted. Then there is recovery, that the system has failed and you recover, and then the establishment theoretically of a new normal. Now, by focusing on only two operational states, normal and failed, you miss the significance of temporary service disruption and real-time indicators for restoration efforts back to normal operation. This is a classic problem of modeling. Modeling does not, because it's not tractable, you have empty cells, system designs, modeling doesn't take into account the temporary loss of service and all the indicators that you can have in disruption to restore you back to normal rather than trigger you into failure. Then recovery is a hugely different exercise. It's largely inter-organizational, inter-stakeholder. You've all discussed this, local communities and so on, that you just do not see in normal operations. And most certainly, the public you've been talking about don't see disruptions. Okay. And please take me back in the question and answer to this whole issue of citizen involvement and the local and so on, because this framework has a lot to say about that. But time permitting for the slides, let me just continue. And then there is the fact that having multiple states of operations means that failure scenarios must specify the states of operations in sufficient granularity. So this what if scenarios that you do for tabletops, if you only invite emergency managers, that is response managers to the crisis that you're scenarioizing, you will get a fundamentally limited view of what that is. Because had you invited control room operators, they would ask, well, what specifically are your failure scenarios? How granular are you talking about? How does the infrastructure fail directly from normal operations, bypassing a restoration or disruption stage? How does it fail after restoration efforts don't work? How long is a recovery prolonged to the point where itself becomes the new normal, which, by the way, is what COVID will probably turn out. It will be a prolonged recovery that will be mistaken for a new normal. Next slide, please. Now, this is a big slide. If you differentiate operations, state of operations, you've also differentiated from the control room high reliability perspective, resilience. Reliability professionals adjusting back to within de jure or de facto bandwidths to continue normal operations exhibit what we call precursor resilience. Without going into details here, those strategies for precursor resilience are fundamentally different than the ones I'm going to be talking about following. Restoration from disrupted operations, temporary loss of service, back to normal operations is restoration resilience. Just to highlight it, for those of you who are practitioners know about control rooms, team situation awareness in restoration is fundamentally different and more intense than in precursor resilience. Emergency response itself, that's another stage, immediately after system failure, involves a lot of those outsiders and is itself a kind of resilience. And recovery exhibits recovery resilience. And why is that different? Because the probability of failure during recovery is higher than in normal operations. So you actually have at least four types of resilience in critical infrastructures. Okay, they're not 8. The good news is they're not 88 definitions, but the news is the important fact is, in other words, resilience is not a single property to be turned on or off when needed at the system level. Resilience involves different strategies and practices, and as such is always on in real time. This again is from the perspective of high reliability management. Next slide, please. I'm coming to the wrap up. Now, the similarities between emergency responders and control rooms are, most notably, we just talked about it in this series of presentations. Control room operations and emergency response are most similar when generalizing. Resilience broadly is bouncing back now and planning the next step ahead. This similarity, though, is not specific or granular enough for failure scenarios that differentiate states and types of resilience. Very often the what-if scenarios, at least in my limited experience in doing tabletops, is simply not granular enough when it comes to the scenario with respect to what failure scenarios you're worried about. Operators, again, sorry to take us back to similarities, operators and responders see the necessity of real-time redundancy, positive redundancy, when it comes to hardware, software, and staff, if not just in case, then just on time. In earlier terms, both control room operators and emergency managers are partisans of high process variance. That's the one thing that keeps the one continuing thread between control, high reliability management, and emergency disaster response is that they want many options and strategies. Both operators and responders are skilled at real-time system-wide pattern recognition and real-time localized scenario formulation, what-if scenarios, including necessarily those systems that are transboundary in operations. Again, to go back, and not to pick on the Dutch, but if we went to the Dutch natural gas system, their worries clearly are transboundary with respect to, say, their German colleagues and so on. Next slide, please. Now, the differences, very important, okay? Emergency responders, unlike control room operators, prepare for, when not actually involved in, the recovery of failed infrastructure operations. Control room operators are much more oriented to ensuring normal and disrupted operations do not fall over. That seems obvious. What is not obvious is the italicized second bullet. This means control operators specialize more in precursor and restoration resilience, while emergency response is its own kind of resilience, with later emergency managers and staff exhibiting recovery resilience. I'm saying these are fundamentally different types of resilience, have different types of strategies, and most certainly have different funding requirements. Next slide, please. In emergency response, ready access to unrestricted funds is critical because money is fungible immediately into response assets. I hope you all understand that. Put the emergency declaration is declared, masses of monies are released, and it's immediately fungible into staff hardware and so on. Control rooms, high reliability is non-fungible. That's why it's reliable. Okay, high reliability is non-fungible in real time. Certain events just must never happen. Nuclear reactors must not blow up. Urban water supplies must not be contaminated by cryptosporidium or worse. Electric grids must not island. Jumbo jets must not drop from the air. Irreplaceable dams and underground water supplies must not breach or overtop, and autonomous underwater vessels must not jeopardize the oil rigs they are repairing. On and on and on. That disasters can and do happen reinforce the dread and commitment of the public to this precluded event standard. This means, and finally to my major point, this means one core emergency management performance standard is helping to maintain the key skills and cognitive processes of control room operators and infrastructures other than emergency management. I have to say, I'm listening to your discussion today, and I'm sorry if I'm misjudging it, but most of the discussion today including the chat discussion, by the way, I'm not picking the presentations, has been about the disasters happened and what should we do. My final point is this: these disasters, transboundary disasters, are being prevented every day. You just don't see them, okay? And the point is, by focusing on the disaster has happened, you're missing the fundamental research finding. The Dutch, among others, have been keeping, TNO has been keeping a database on actual disruptions and failures in key infrastructures. And they find that most disruptions do not cascade over into other infrastructures. They're contained. There are certain infrastructures like energy that do cascade over, but even then the disruptions are contained by management. So I'm asking you to please think about making visible these trade-offs that you have between prevention through ongoing control room operations versus the disasters happened. And obviously you need to respond to it. Let me end there.
Thank you very much, Emery.
That's my self-serving list of research.
That's very useful, and it will be available to everybody. Thank you, Emery, and thank you all of you for really inspiring insights. It's made my head spin, as I expected, and as I quite enjoy that, to understand the complexity of what we're faced with, and try and use that as a basis for being creative and constructive, analytically, critically, and with a design head on. There are quite a lot of questions in the chat for both of you, Kees and Emery. Maybe we can give Emery a moment to have a moment and maybe look at the chat, or I can read out some of the questions. Kees, you've had some chance to look at some of the questions. Would you like to start us off discussing this part? And Simon and Philippe, by all means, feel free to come in. And final thing, if anyone wants to come in and speak, if you could raise your hand, that would be really good. And then we can unmute you.
Yeah, we already started to have a discussion on the chat, picking up some of the issues being raised about citizens' involvement, and there was a reason why I mentioned vulnerability, and I don't know, Emery, if that partly answers your question, and it might be that we are looking indeed at different beasts, right? So I know there's not such a thing as a natural disaster, but if a heat wave happens, then for the citizens being prepared and being less vulnerable contributes for me also to the resilience of the community. And then how that is related to high reliable organizations and response room control operators, that for me is always a bit of a puzzle. But what I know by talking also to first responders is that investing in the local communities, know where the vulnerable people are, expanding their social capital may prevent victims from a heat wave. So for me, investing in and understanding the local community and local vulnerability moves beyond responding to a heat wave. In that sense, a heat wave shouldn't necessarily turn into a crisis if the local capacity of the local community is being recognized, and if there is has been proper preparation and all that. So that for me is also part of the discussion about involving local communities. And then are those local initiatives, that was one of the discussions in the chat, are they transboundary and transborder? Maybe not necessarily, but it has been recognized that during the pandemic, you see those initiatives virtually all over the world in different cities. And there are some informal networks, transboundary and cross-border, but even the recognition of those local initiatives can also helping interstate or governments to more properly respond to a crisis like COVID-19. So that is, it is partly thinking out loud, but partly trying to connect citizens' initiatives, local resilience / vulnerability to debates on such things as high reliability.
Can I come in with, yeah, the, you know, I have to say, what I'm going to say will sound reactionary. So I am a product of the 68 and the left progressive. But if we said this citizens' involvement and local participation and the local, I truly understand, and I hope I support everything that you've been saying on the side of the disaster has happened or preparing people for when the disaster happens. So nothing of what I'm saying argues against that. I am talking about the trade-offs in the allocation of resources and visibility.
Sure.
Okay, and my answer is if you bring control room operators into your tabletop, real-time control centers, into your tabletop, you will have, if you will, a proxy for some of the citizen involvement. The problem with citizen involvement is this, okay, that we go out and in one tabletop exercise we had in San Francisco, assume something happens, citizens are there. How do you make it visible to them? Well, we show, in fact, that if there's a flood on the major part of in San Francisco, here is what's going to happen. Take a cross section of a road. There underneath the road itself, a major road, you will find the water pipes, the sewerage pipes, the fiber optic pipes. And they look at that and they say, oh, Jesus Christ, we will lose all of that. See, from a control room perspective, yeah, you lose that, and that's a local problem. But unless that water main and that fiber optics and that sewerage part was a choke point in the interconnected systems for water and so on, then you don't worry as much because many of these systems have designed for redundancy. So if that section goes out, that goes out, that goes out, their respective systems don't go out. Now here's the problem in a nutshell. Say we do that. Then you've identified the citizens, we identify the choke points in the system. Do we really want broader publication of choke points? Just as in ransomware, do we really want to advertise and publicize the patch that works? I don't think so. Okay, I mean, these are questions that are really issues of security, reliability, and so on. This does not make me anti-populist, reactionary, but it is a real problem that can at least be addressed by having operators in there saying, excuse me, please, here are our choke points. And notice that the choke points are actually co-located next to each other for, I'm making it up, natural gas and water and roads. Maybe we should focus our attention there.
Yeah, Simon, exactly the person I was going to ask to come in on this. Yes, please.
Yeah, just to, well, I'll just listen to you, and it's really interesting. But I think, in terms of, you talked about trade-offs and talking about that perhaps direct citizen involvement isn't so good here. And in one sense, I agree with you, but then I think that we need to be a bit more careful in how we're defining resilience or local resilience, because there are different types here in terms of citizen involvement. What you're referring to is more direct citizen, like more, I don't know if this is the correct term, more like direct resilience, in the sense, okay, so how do we prepare you and me, my children, for a disaster, or how they're going to, like, so yeah, how do you go on, what do you do if an earthquake happens, or if there's a tsunami, you run to the highest hill, or whatever that may be. This is more sort of a like direct, but there's also this sort of more idea, this idea of an indirect resilience, this long-term resilience about establishing a sense of community solidarity that provides a bedrock for those cases when everything does go wrong, even if all of the systems often do work and do mitigate a lot of the risks and a lot of potential disasters. Sometimes we do have black swans, and sometimes COVID happens, and so there needs to be an underlying supportive social structure that we can try and develop the best as we can in order to be more adaptable or to be transformative when these things hit. So sorry, just so I mean, more of a concrete example of how this could actually happen. I've done a lot of work in the Caribbean and the Pacific Islands, and there, for example, you have a number of international organizations with development projects that are designed to increase social solidarity, for example, through encouraging greater self-esteem amongst the youth, encouraging the youth to interact with the older generation in terms of creating sort of more of a social cohesion, to understand who your neighbor is, in a sense. So these types of initiatives, I think, are really important. And it's not that one outdoes the other, but it's more of a complementary approach. But I think that at the end, it's about being more careful about how we're using the term resilience.
Yeah, I saw you discuss with Kees the role of exercises in that case, and Simon, maybe you could say a few words about that. But we also have Uberto, who gave us a couple of examples about local resilience, and I think we're kind of productively abstract with it, but I think we could do with some more examples. So Uberto, could I ask you to talk about some of the examples that you mentioned? You have to unmute
yeah,
yourself.
sure.
Yes. Great.
Yeah. Thank you, Monica. Yeah, what I meant with my comment on the chart is that when we have been starting to discuss the application of a resilience assessment in local communities, we found out some typical limitations. Where do you put the boundaries of a community, and how can you assess resilience in larger communities? So even if we speak now about the pandemics, the reaction of one large community like Italy was then fragmented into regions, and then regions were fragmented into cities. So all these kind of boundaries pop up whenever you enter the political discussions. What we found studying with Resilioc is that we start from the local community. Great. We try to approach resilience in a very localized way. So there's not such an approach to resilience which is valid for every community, because they are different in culture, they are different in any kind of let's say history or solidarity or whatever. But there should be something that allows us to assess resilience in a common way. And this is the effort of the project. Then when you work with local communities, you realize that there are similarities, yes, but basically it is not only about resources, it is not only about to convince citizens to participate, which yes, it is a challenge, I confirm. It's also about the targets that you set for yourselves. So we believe that resilience in absolute terms is very sort of impossible to analyze. And then we are turning into defining the local resilience with the local targets. This means that each community can set their own targets for being resilient against a specific scenario in a specific situation. And then the challenge is how to extend and scale up this approach to larger communities that inevitably will appear once you look at a solution at regional or national level. So this kind of tension between being local and very tailored to the local needs and being political on a larger scale, which means finances, which means regulation and laws, is very much a challenge. And I found that this discussion of transboundary resilience resembles a lot the trans-community, trans-local resilience. It's not that different in the end. We always have the challenges of sort of boundaries in a way.
Yeah. Frank, yes, yes, why not? Yes.
If I may add something on that, Umberto, that's very correct to state that probably the main problem is the shift of boundaries in your concept, I think. So if you change from one system to the other system, the same rules may not really apply. And that's a little bit my questions for Emory. So if you look at it from the high reliability management perspective, where you have kind of closed system, what would be the approach in that if you expand the boundaries to a new system? Can you simply transfer the rules and the knowledge, or what can society learn from that in principle to be more resilient in the sense of a high reliability organization?
Can I take COVID as an example? If we were to, and I'll be very quick about this, if we were to parse COVID-19 pandemic through the high reliability lens that I presented in brief today, in more detail if you read more of it, we would come up with 4 characteristics that characterize COVID that are important for a high reliability framework. COVID is highly uncertain, highly complex, high speed of propagation, and in scale effect, global, moving from local to global very easily. Now, a high reliability perspective would say much of the high reliability theory in management, we would have a hard time with that kind of problem. So the first thing we would want to do is identify the aspects of COVID, which are in fact, components are in fact either high reliably focused already, that is the vaccination programs, at least in the US and UK. We vaccinate people all the time, even with the crazies out there, anti-vaxxers, we vaccinate all the time. So the issue was upscaling something that we knew. But other aspects of the COVID are something we don't know. They're full of unknown unknowns. So the first thing is identify what is highly reliable or could be made, or alternatively in your frameworks, what really is R&D, research and development, such that you're really learning as the target is moving, okay? You would be aware of any cross-sectional conclusion about COVID, you know, saying early on, oh, look, Taiwan works and Swedes don't, okay? Well, as you move on, it got more complex. These are vast longitudinal problems that require focus looking at over time before you go into the blame game or make assumptions. So yes, you changed the boundaries, but let me conclude it by saying, actually, Umberto's comment, where he sees fragmentation as a problem, the high reliability types would see it as far less a problem. Because the issue, and I again now speak from an ideological view of the left, the fundamental issue about COVID isn't how to manage it. The fundamental issue is the effect of gender, race, inequality, nationalism, broad forces at work. And that when you take a longitudinal view of COVID, you will find that Northern Italy constellated around a set of different larger forces, in response to COVID than Southern Italy did. Okay, that there may be forces at work that are peculiar to the locality or the region. And that's where we want to get to, is to understand the constellation or the aggregation of the complex forces. And that is really longitudinal. I would say COVID is, it is not even a mega crisis. It's something unique that we're facing here. And we should keep our minds open to it. Let me end there. I was going to.
Yeah, so a couple of follow-on questions there, Emery. Could you do the same thing for climate change? I know it's a big challenge, big question. And then,
yeah.
Can I just try something on you? So, the reason why we are putting together HRM and HRO and disaster management is kind of a gut feeling that we are at a moment of transformative, disruptive change in public protection and disaster response, and we need new ideologies, new models for it. And I keep thinking that if we applied a more HRM approach to disaster risk management, it would enable such a transformation. It would require a complete rethinking of how we resource it and how we involve citizens and how we think about citizens. And it might not be possible, but if we think that like climate change and COVID are these kind of slow emerging endless crises, then we need to do something like that. So
well, I think you're actually seeing this differentiation already. I have in mind maybe an unrepresentative meta-analysis. About a year ago, somebody did a meta-analysis of climate change effects on the environment, on public health, and so on. So I forget how many studies they reviewed, and indeed, the general conclusion was on net, climate change will have a negative impact on health, go down the list, okay? But then you went to the supplementary material and actually read the details. And then they admitted, well, there are, if you will, climate change neutral effects. And in some rare instances, climate change positive effects. And then he actually went in and looked at the list that they made of neutral and positive. And again, I'm going to sound like climate change is good, but once you differentiate climate change impacts, as these studies are doing themselves, you will see chances for local response, okay, and local learning. That in fact, there may be ways to generate better practices over a run of diverse cases that are being opened with climate change. They may not work, but I'm saying we're in a period where we have to actually monitor those neutral and positive as much as we monitor the obvious negative. And I don't want to seem to be a Holocaust denier here. Climate change is going on. It's going on, but really it's much more differentiated. Mm-hmm. And we will see its differentiation precisely in those factors that matter to me. The implication of inequality, racism, colonialism, imperialism will be far more differentiated when it comes to these bigger issues.
And it comes back to the question of how to mobilize PPDR agencies and enable PPDR agencies and citizens to engage with the complexity of those diverse and place-based. You basically need place-based innovation and place-based analysis, place-based innovations that demand.
Well, you need both, in the sense, I don't mean to be amelioratory here, but you need both the better practices that evolve over a run of different cases that then are modified to the local. So there is a lot of learning going on. Each new case that has to be modified adds to the better practice. And I'm just submitting to you that better practices are already out there. Yeah. in some of these so-called neutral and positive responses that we might want to look at more closely.
I think this might be a point where we have a lot of people in the room and a conversation between just a few of us. I wonder if we could switch, if you could give me control for the screen, Anthony, I could just share my screen and invite you to go to and put in a code, which I will give you in a moment. And then we can broaden out the conversation a little bit more. If you go to menti.com and put in this code, you will be prompted to add some thoughts about what you've learned today, what, if anything, you will do differently, what more PSCE could do. Any thoughts from you would be very welcome and interesting. So maybe we could just take a minute or two for people to just add their thoughts and widen the conversation responses. Yeah, that's great. On this point here, share best practice examples about cross-border resilience. Simon, are you in a position to tell us about the Swedish wildfires?
Not really. I don't know much about them at all. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, that's fine. I know not that much about it myself, but I know that in Poland, some of the units that are part of the civil protection mechanism that have skill, they went over to Sweden to assist, and one of the big challenges around it is the language of how people can collaborate with each other. So
right. I mean, I know that just generally that previously the logistics have always been very difficult because often the forest fires occur at the same time in multiple countries. And this is one of the reasons I think that, that they established Risk EU, where the EU has its own capacities, and I believe that the new legislation that's come out this year just reinforces that and providing additional capacities. But the establishing standards so operative standards is definitely crucial in that regard as well. But the hurdles in terms of finances and actual capacities, I think, are being sorted out. But I'm sorry that I can't help you in terms of the exact operations that went on in Sweden. I've got lots of colleagues that have written lots about it, but I've been doing other things.
yeah, I mean, so that's one thing that I would like to discuss is what more can PSCE do to support the debate around transboundary resilience. And one thing that we could do is invite your colleagues to the conference in December and have a session on transboundary resilience, for example. Or Marie-Christine, do you have other ideas for what we could do in PSCE to support the debate?
Yeah, I was just thinking of also, because there are so many activities that are running in everywhere, in every country at European level, in many EU projects. So mapping even broadly the activity could be really interesting in order to guide people who are interested in these topics. Because I think that the discussion should, of course, is very important from a research point of view, but we should guide also the other groups to engage in these debates.
Yes, Philippe mentioned a meeting tomorrow, actually, and a document that will be produced that reviews projects that are working in this space. So we could have a look at that.
Yeah, because, you know, they are producing a lot of deliverables, so it would be good to know the ones that are really relevant and could be shared from the different projects.
Yeah.
And of course, having this discussion and having regularly some workshop or some exchange with a different group would be also very interesting. So we'd have to see for December what we can plan.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be an interesting. One question I have is this point about the problem and potential of local resilience has been discussed, and we have talked about how it needs to be scaled up and down sideways. But the global dimension, how that comes in, I think that is also important, how we think that together. I'm thinking, for example, about in the UK we have the Youth Parliament, and young people are really concerned about climate change, not just locally but also globally, and there is a real resource for building community resilience, not just through volunteering and activities locally, but have that kind of global dimension in mind at the same time. Yep, and I think we will have a really interesting discussion in relation to the special issue about the role of HRM and high reliability organizations and the philosophies behind that. But I think with had a really lively discussion, and it seems we've come to an end, really. So I would like to really thank Simon, Kees, Emery, and Philippe very much for a really inspiring webinar. It's been it really made my head spin in a really good way. So, and
Thank you.
everybody, the whole audience, it was really interesting to see all the comments, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. Just a point of information: the presentation will be shared to everybody. So, and also there will be some information on PSCE website. So if you are looking for more, you can find there.
Yeah, and if you have any suggestions for follow-on activities like a session at the conference, then any speakers that you would like to suggest, then please let us know. And other than that, I think I would just say we close the session.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Monica.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Roberto.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Nice to
Bye.
see you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Can you get the chat copied,
Yes.
Marie-Christine,
Yes.
so that we have
Yeah.
that as well?
Yeah, because it's very rich. There were a lot of discussion in the chat.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was really
Yeah.
fantastic. Now people turn their cameras on.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Marie-Christine,
Yeah.
normalement, vous avez en bas le bouton record
Pour l'arrêter.
Ouais.
Okay.